Welcome. And this has been a lot of fun for Toby and myself to put together, and Chris's input as well has really helped it. But as you can see, we're bringing together a couple of passions. So volunteer gardening and volunteer involvement. So this session is around how does your volunteer garden grow? Lessons in sustainable cultivation. Do you want to introduce ourselves? So Toby, people have met me already today. So Toby.
Okay, great. Some of you know me, but maybe you don't. I'm Tobi Johnson. I'm in East Tennessee right now, where I live part-time. And I am the president and founder of Tobi Johnson and Associates and Volunteer Pro. And I'm the host of the Volunteer Nation podcast, whom both Ruth and Chris have been wonderful guests on. And I was here a couple of years ago in Manchester doing a volunteer training on volunteer recruitment, which was a lot of fun, a workshop. Yeah, and I love everything gardening. You're going to see. So if you're a gardener, you're going to love this. But also, I just want to point out every single picture in this slide deck is from Ruth and myself. There are no stock photos except the last video. No stock photos. It's all us getting grubby. So I'm also an avid master gardener volunteer and have been. I'll be in my 10th year next year. So this is what I do for volunteering, and so does Ruth.
Excellent. Thank you. So I will reintroduce myself quickly. So you'll have met me earlier as the chair of the Association of Volunteer Managers. I'm also working very closely with Chris on developing the Academy for Volunteer Management at Team Kinetic. And I'm a freelance consultant on all things volunteering and volunteer management. So there are some contact details. And yes, there are some grubby photos coming up. So in our conversations, we came up with the idea that effective volunteer management is a lot like gardening. You need thoughtful design, you need to be thinking, how do we tend and support? And you also need a little bit of luck to help with some of those healthy gardens. You don't just plant the seeds for volunteering, you've got to create the environment and help things thrive. So for us, we're asking the question, the volunteer managers, the gardeners are volunteering. So to get us started, we'd really like to hear your views. Do feel free to put things in the chat. What do you think of a healthy, thriving garden? What is it that you're imagining? What does it look like? Diversity. Anyone else? There you go. Oh, it's all coming through now. So we have got room to throw and thrive, perfect. Vibrant, lush and green, loads of diversity from Chris. Variety of plants, good roots. Organized chaos, I like that. Thanks, Luke. Straubs. Rich, diverse ecosystem. Fits in with the surroundings. Well-watered. Bees and butterflies. No weeds. Organic. Stay sustained, well nourished. There's a whole range of things, and I think through our talk you'll see that we're taking all of these things into consideration. It'll feed into lots of different things that we're thinking. Toby, anything you wanted to add for what you actually think is a healthy, thriving garden?
Well, I'll talk later about soil, but for me, it's all about the foundation and the soil. Nothing comes unless we have fabulous soil, but also that we enjoy it. That we really, when I'm out in my garden, it's therapy for me. It calms I know my blood pressure goes down. I'm calm. I feel like I've done the right things. I know what I'm doing. I'm confident, but I'm also having fun. Lots of joy, I think gardens bring.
Joy. Perfect. And there's a nice way we'll come back to joy during the conversation of involving volunteers. Okay, so we really dig our volunteers. Oh, Chris.
Rick says lots of weeds, and we'll show you weeds.
We absolutely will. And there was a comment around making sure we had those foundations for growth, that kind of understanding that was going in there. So just as a gardener plans the layout of their garden, those involving volunteers really carefully design the structures and the processes for volunteer involvement. So we really want to make sure we are building those ecosystems and thinking about what's coming out for the whole range of of people and plants in the gardening case that might want to be grown. So we're thinking about some of those designing. We want to understand, and it's coming up already, what's needed. We think about the space and the environment. Is it south facing? Is it against a wall? About the soil and the other conditions. What kind of style and effect do you like? So some people want a garden full of weeds and some people don't want any weeds at all. We saw that in the chat coming through. But what kind of style do you want? Or in the case of involving volunteers, that your organization might need. Volunteer involvement does need to start with that kind of planning as well. You need that clear understanding of the needs of the organization and the motivations of potential volunteers as well. Also thinking about some of the risks that there might be, because planning does look at assessing risks. So if we're looking at gardening, is there a fast growing plant with lots of roots that was going to swamp all the others around it? And does a volunteer role feel too much like paid employment? So have a look at all of the kind of risks for gardening and for volunteering. And in both cases, you need to make sure there's a contingency plan to address those challenges effectively. Tending and caring. A gardener is going to nurture their plants to ensure that they thrive. And just the same, volunteer involvement requires that ongoing care and support with personalized engagement and understanding what a volunteer needs. For me, I think a really important thing is around relationships. In fact, they're rooted in relationships. And yes, I worked on that pun, so apologies. Just as we know what different plants might need, we also need to make sure we're understanding different volunteer motivations, giving them the meaningful roles that make sense for them, and maintaining that ongoing conversation. And we're also going to make sure we have the right tools for the job at every stage. So for me, this was me at the weekend doing some gardening in a garden that supports women affected by domestic abuse. And I needed a fork for this particular piece of trying to drop the root out. There are other things I've moved on to, and you'll see a picture later on, which is even less flattering of how I've actually finally got it up, because I decided I needed a spade. So we really have to start thinking about what kind of tools do we need to support that. There's an element of adaptability and luck as well. Sometimes things happen and it doesn't necessarily, thank you, and it doesn't necessarily go as we'd planned. Is it something we want to work with, or do we see that as a weed and remove it? And clearly there are going to be some problems. Whenever you involve lots of volunteers, there might be things that go wrong. And whenever you've got a garden, however perfect you want it to be, things might come out. So we have to make sure those issues are resolved constructively. And I think some of the things that were coming up in the chat and some of the reasons why people love gardening is that experimentation. Let's have a play. Let's see what happens. Involving volunteers is a lot around experimentation, looking for innovative approaches and adapting to changing circumstances. And gardening is like that as well. Things happen. Mistakes are opportunities for growth, and being able to think reflectively about how we do that both in gardening and volunteer involvement really helps to ensure that continuous improvement. And for both areas, we need to be thinking about resources and that future infrastructure. Both of them need dedicated resources. It could be the time, training and financial support. You need to make sure you've got a fork and a spade, or all of those kind of things that you might be wanting. You've got the right tools to do the jobs. Diversity has come up in the chat as well. So I think successful involvement in both gardening and involving volunteers does have a look at making sure we've got that inclusive opportunity, welcoming diversity and addressing any barriers. And that's just as much as when we want to create a beautiful garden. So just like in gardening, volunteer involvement is not a passive or an accidental process. It requires that intentional design, consistent care and adaptability so that we can get that positive experience for volunteers. We've looked at how the healthy garden starts with that solid planning. So the best volunteer programs, thoughtfully designed with the end in mind, focusing on clear goals, adaptability and meaningful engagement. Just as the gardener plans that their garden will flourish, organisations plan that their volunteering achieves impactful and healthy results. So it's really interesting to hear the range of gardens that you thought of when you thought of your perfect garden, because there are lots of different things that people can be doing. Gardening and volunteering opportunities come in all shapes and sizes, and the best ways of doing that is to be looking at it in mind. I shared a copy of my book earlier, and as I said in that book on volunteer involvement, it's wise to be suspicious of any plans to involve armies of volunteers, because armies dress the same and follow orders, but volunteers and gardens are different. I didn't say the and gardens in the book, I'm using that here. And the places where and the ways they become involved are different. And that is so true of both volunteering and of gardening. Plants are different. They're happy in different environments. They need different kinds of food to be able to support them. Volunteers come with different motivations and preferences, and as we've seen, the plants have those as well. Volunteering and gardening has to be designed to accommodate that diversity of what people want, so that the volunteers and the plants can align and grow and be nourished in that way. The different organisational contexts. Volunteer involvement spans across various settings. It can go from small community groups to large charities to public statutory services and even private business. And each of them needs a tailored support to do that. And we heard from Gethin earlier about volunteering is not a one-size-fits-all opportunity. You have to consider this kind of landscaping and design choice. If you're running a highly structured traditional volunteer program, particularly within some of the larger organizations, you'll have staff that coordinate the activities, set direction, and put volunteers into predefined roles. You could see that as like a topiary or a really highly formalized gardens, all of which are very, very beautiful, also expensive, time consuming, and quite hard to maintain. There's specific tasks and they operate within that structured framework. The polyculture really speaks to some of that diversity element, and recognizing that diversity makes us stronger. It's for a volunteer involving organization that is working in their space. It could be around where there's a lot of collaboration and the volunteer voice are recognized as much as being part of the processes of the decision making. Lots of federated organizations are working in this way, where local branches are run autonomously by volunteers, but supported by the central guidance and the training. The volunteers are playing that key role in defining the aims and the benefits of the activities. And the wilding element is where you're working with the nature and not against it. You're not trying to put it into any formal way. You're trying to just let things happen. And that's probably where lots of the weeds might be coming out in a positive sense rather than anything. It's where we're really looking at, from a volunteering perspective, having flexible volunteering, being co-designed by members of the community. It's very grassroots and movement oriented. And the majority of charities are completely volunteer led and operating solely with volunteers, and they manage some of those day-to-day. That is Hampton Court. Good spot, Chris. It's a pond garden in Hampton Court. The wilding area from a volunteering perspective is where volunteers are taking the initiative and leading the activities, and often self-organized. So this picture of the pond garden at Hampton Court, which is one of Tobi's pictures, it's really similar to that more formal, obviously, transactional model of volunteering. It's very structured and hierarching. It focuses on volunteers being a resource. But in contrast, a participatory model is looking at that collaboration and autonomy. Okay, so we need to be thinking about the right plant and the right place, and purposefully matching and making sure it's reaching where the plants need to be, and in the same way where volunteers might want to be, because not all volunteers are the same and they don't want to volunteer in the same way. Involving volunteers is individual, innovative and ever-changing, just to thinking where plants should be based on what their needs and their motivations are. Volunteers aren't just resources filling gaps, and plants aren't the same. They're not put in place just because we think they should be. We've got to make sure that we're likening it to gardening, giving people the right conditions, making sure just as a gardener selects the soil, the sunlight and the water for each plant, volunteer matching also aligns roles with volunteer skills, interests and availability. And that's where the volunteers will thrive, just as we can see that a plant will thrive in that area. Place the volunteers in the roles that resonate with their strengths and their passions, and they will flourish. They will contribute meaningfully. And conversely, if you've got mismatched roles and volunteers feeling coerced into activities they might not suit them, that can lead to frustration. So that could be like planting a flower that loves the sun in a shady spot. It's not going to thrive. It'll probably die. So thoughtful matching ensures that volunteers are valued, supported, and they're really empowered. I think there's a lot there that hopefully you can see some of where we're go into. Is there anything you wanted to add on the purposeful matching, Toby, or shall we move on to the next slide?
Oh, I think it's sometimes surprising too when a volunteer, we don't always know what the right match is. Through a lot of listening, which is our research, right? Our conversations with volunteers. Sometimes, when we're planting things, we're reading the seed packets, we're talking to other gardeners, maybe we're doing interviews and we're also talking to references. But sometimes, surprisingly, a plant will thrive in an area where you don't believe it will thrive. And anybody know where this plant is, where this photo is from? Because this is another one of my photos. Before I share what it is, because it blew my mind when I went to this garden. It absolutely blew my mind. Anybody? It's a difficult one because I'm not showing any context. It is St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall. So this is a castle. You've got to go across a causeway that goes underwater when the tide comes up. It is a magical place. And when we got there and started walking around, I'm like, what are these succulents? I look like it feels like I'm in the desert. But because of the roundness of the space and the microclimate that it's in, it allows these succulents to absolutely thrive. So I think when we think about volunteers and where they might thrive, I think we need to question our bias, right, about what we think's going to work, right, and trust a little bit in the volunteer and what they tell us, but also do a little bit of experimentation. When I'm working in my garden, I'll buy like one plant and I'll put it, I'll usually get it off the sale table and I'll put it in a part of my garden where I think it's going to work out. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you can collaboratively work with volunteers to test out different roles and see how they do. Now, when I say that, I say collaboratively, we have a discussion about it, but would you like to give it a go? Maybe it's a leadership role, or maybe it's something that they want to learn, but they haven't had the chance to learn yet. So I think, first of all, we can be very surprised. And second of all, we can co-create opportunities with our volunteers. Even if we have existing opportunities, we can figure out, would you like to try this opportunity? It's an existing one. We're not necessarily creating it from whole cloth here, but, so there's flexibility and there's your existing roles.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll move on to the next slide for you. So, Toby.
Yeah. Ellie was close. Yeah. So there was another Cornwall garden. There are just so many wonderful gardens. Anyway, so let's talk with planning and fertile growth. I don't know if this is supposed to say planning or maybe it's supposed to say fertile growth. I don't know. But here's Ruth again, pulling out that stubborn root ball with her last week's weekend volunteering session.
This is when I realized the fork was not the right tool. I needed a spade to really get in there.
That's right. Sometimes we got to switch our tactics, right? So I will say that soil looks amazing. The soil, because it has all that great mulch on it. But there's a fair amount of weeds, it looks like, but could be cover crop. Don't know. Well, we're going to get into, fertilizer and soil conditioning are some of the ways that we build the capacity of our soil to grow healthy plants. When I first started gardening, when I became a master gardener and started studying, and as in my internship as a volunteer, I didn't really realize the power of the soil. And I see the soil as your culture, your volunteer culture. It's the place that absolutely is the foundation for anything you're going to do. Of course, we need to have good planning. We need to think about our ecosystem. Your culture, in some ways, is everything almost, in terms of if you have poor soil, you can put any plant in that soil and it's unless it's a plant that absolutely thrives in poor soil. And you think about those volunteers who are super gritty, who are just going to gut it out no matter how hard it gets. Those are those folk. But most volunteers need a fertile soil. They need good soil conditions. They need a culture that is enabling them to be at their best. And so there's a couple of ways we improve the soil. One is through fertilization. And, you know, lots of people ask, when do you fertilize, et cetera. And there are specific times and specific amounts of fertilization for different plants. So when you think of volunteers, it's always giving them the right support at the right time. So in particular, when we put a plant in the ground, initially it needs some fertilizer to get going. And if you think about volunteers when they're new to our organizations, they need some support to get growing, right? Get growing with our organization. So I would be super interested in the chat if anybody wants to share what are some innovative ways they build or pay attention to or attend to their volunteer culture. And while folks are talking, I'll talk about the second area of building your soil, which is soil conditioning. So we have the minerals and the way the soil, the pH of the soil and all that, that's through fertilization and some amendments. But soil conditioning is, how does the soil feel? What's the texture? And, you know, if you think about it, different volunteer cultures have different feelings to them. Some volunteer cultures feel like a family. Some volunteer cultures feel with a group, feels like a group of people who are experts in what they do. Some volunteer cultures feel very ad hoc. We're doing what we want to do. We come together and we do our thing together. So some volunteer cultures are serious because they need to be, because they're doing some work that they're working with people who are in serious perhaps health, but they're also having some joy. So there's lots of different cultures. So soil conditioning is really about creating the right feeling, the right texture. How would people describe your volunteer culture when they come to your organization? But would love to hear in the chat of any ways people are building their volunteer culture, or if you're not sure right now, if a complete stranger were to walk into your organization and start volunteering, how would they describe that experience? What's the feeling of the culture? Staff culture clashes with volunteering culture. Yeah, absolutely. And that's when we have to do that, you know, managing upward and talk about, you know, volunteering is not in a, you know, just like plants, they're not in a hermetically sealed environment unless we have, you know, row covers and all that. There's cross-pollination happening. If there's a drought in this part of the garden, there's probably going to be a drought in this part of the garden. And so sometimes things happen in gardens that we can't control, and sometimes there's things we can do to help control, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Staff take priority over volunteers. Yeah. So you've got to have a strategy for helping volunteers and making sure staff understand the priority of volunteers. And that, you know, in terms of strategy, Chris, culture eats strategy, that's true. But to build culture, creating a philosophy of volunteer involvement or a commitment to community statement, working with your leadership to make sure anyone who's working with volunteers has the responsibility of volunteers in some way in their job description so that they are evaluated on it. Conducting surveys to understand what your culture is and sharing that with leadership, because if there's problems, they're going to come up in that survey and you can share the data versus it just being you saying like, hey, we've got a problem. Well, actually we have the data that proves we have a problem that needs addressing. So yeah, absolutely. Clear, share, purpose. So this soil is so important. And sometimes it's about capacity building also. Sometimes bringing in advisors, trainers, information, resources, whatever you can get, like today's training, where you can get some additional outside perspective on how to build this culture. The volunteer experience is everything. It really is. If people, you can have the most beautiful paperwork and onboarding process in the world, but if people don't feel valued, and if they are in a culture that does not feel good to them, they will probably not be that plant that survives in any soil condition. Ruth, do you want to add anything here?
I think it's a really interesting conversation to see that lots of things that are coming up is around the staff volunteering split, and where can we think around how do we improve that culture, and leaning on some of those earlier things about diversity and inclusion and being able to hear from people who aren't necessarily in the staff makeup might really feed into some of those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things is aligning the organization's goals with the volunteer program goals and making sure those are very clearly aligning, so that when you're making the case for change, we're doing a lot of change management work inside our impact lab, our Volunteer Pro Impact Lab. And it's a lot about not only understanding how that alignment happens, but also changing. We did a seminar last week on changing how we communicate so that we can get buy-in. There's actually strategies for communication that are better suited to getting buy-in. So protecting your soil on this, so protecting your culture. If you have a robust volunteer culture, there are things you can do to shore it up, no matter what everybody else is thinking about it. Of course, it's good that, if there's a culture of we don't respect and value volunteers organizationally, volunteers are going to feel that. So that's a conversation to have, right? But there's also things you can do to protect your soil or your culture. One is mulching, and we all know what mulching does. Well, we don't all, but I'll share what mulching does. So mulching protects from erosion. It keeps the soil moist. It makes sure that weeds don't grow. So folks who have too many weeds, check out, it's time to pull and mulch, right? And it's amazing what can happen when you mulch properly. So when we think about mulching and protecting your soil, we want to protect the soil and almost create a microenvironment underneath. The other interesting thing is we definitely, when we're going through change, don't want to dig up and till up the whole infrastructure. Sometimes we feel like we need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but there's actually mycorrhiza that grow in our soil and they're connected. And it used to be that tilling your soil was the thing to do. Now it's absolutely not the thing to do. The connections between the mycorrhiza in your soil actually help your plants communicate. So if you think about the social capital of your volunteers, you want to make sure you keep that intact. The network of volunteers, the friendships, the feeling of community. When you're making change, you've got to be careful not to disrupt that too much. So it's never throwing the entire baby out with the bathwater, because there's something fantastic going on in your volunteer program. There's probably more than one, right? So mulching is about, also protecting from sunburn. Soil gets burnt. Isn't that interesting? The other thing is soil breathes. It exudes air and it lets out air. It takes air in and it exudes air. So I was learning from one of my master gardener volunteers that you don't want to take giant sheets of cardboard or giant sheets of cover to cover an area to suppress weeds. You need to break them up because there needs to be airflow. So we've got to have a little bit of freedom, and in the way that we work with our volunteers, we've got to let that soil breathe. We can't be really doing that command and control way of management, because it just doesn't work with anybody anymore. So another way to help our soils and protect our soils from erosion, from sunburn, from losing moisture, from having weeds compete with our wonderful plants and our growing volunteers, is ground cover. So people will plant ground cover. In the summer, it's buckwheat. In the fall, winter, spring, it's more rye and clover and all your cool season veg. Where I also garden in the Pacific Northwest, which is very similar to the climate in the UK. So cover crops enrich the soil. They actually make the soil better through their roots. And once they're done, we just kind of chop and drop and leave them there, and they actually make the soil better. So when I thought about the metaphor of ground cover, I thought about making sure that our roles are really, truly meaningful to our volunteers. That's going to enrich that soil. Their roots are going to grow in deeper. Also, building teams. You know, we will often with ground cover, especially in cool seasons, we will use a mix of seeds. So when that's about that diversity and about that team working together to really condition that soil and keep it from losing. So losing its culture, losing its texture. So you really want to think about, how are you pulling people together? How are you making sure there are meaningful roles so you have that ground cover to protect against the context and the environment and the weather and the climate that you may not have control over? Third thing is pruning and weeding, and we've talked about that quite a bit. If there are approaches that are no longer working, like when Ruth was digging out that giant root ball, she was testing different tools, like which tool. Finally, it was the spade that did it. And then she was like, I'm triumphant, you know? So we want to make sure that we are weeding out any, we've always done it this way just because we've always done it this way. This is not helpful to us. We've got to keep testing, and especially in today's world, like sales and marketing, which AKA volunteer recruitment and outreach, is changing so rapidly that everybody is struggling to keep up, even, you know, entrepreneurs like myself, businesses. So it requires everyone to start testing a lot to figure out what used to work doesn't work anymore. So we've got to evolve. So pruning and weeding is about removing, you know, when we're pruning, we're removing the dead, the diseased, and sometimes things that aren't working with the shape we want. And then weeding, we're just pulling out things. Now, I will say the definition of a weed is just the wrong plant in the wrong place. So sometimes weeds are great. Maybe they're acting as ground cover in a certain part of your garden. Maybe you like the look of that weed, right? So I would say be careful on how disparaging we are about weeds. Every plant has a place in our garden, right? So if you're wondering what this picture is, this is when we talk about weeding. This is me in our place in the Pacific Northwest. That's me last summer weeding out and blackberry canes. We have huge mounds of Himalayan blackberry. It's very, very invasive. And I have these amazing gloves, the right tool. They don't, it doesn't stick through. And we pulled out that and more in a single day. Isn't that crazy? Anything you want to add here, Ruth?
I suppose I was thinking a little bit about some of the questions we were looking at earlier in the conference about the right to volunteer and getting the right ready volunteer to come in. And if we just looked at that, we might lose some of those amazing weeds that don't look like the right ones, but are ones that actually add so much value and diversity and other things into that element. I think, sorry, it's moved away slightly from protecting your soil, but it's also those weeds are a great protector as well.
Yeah. Rick says most of my weeds are beloved. Some weeds are beautiful. The other thing is, like dandelions, you can eat them. They're edible. There's a lot there. So yeah, it's a fun way to think about it. I hope folks are enjoying this metaphoric sort of journey through gardening and volunteer engagement. We thought it was a lot of fun. So, okay, let's talk about getting the most out of your garden. So we really, when you're working with volunteers, productivity does matter. Like if you're growing if you're growing a vegetable garden, or you have a fruit orchard, you want to make sure you're getting, or maybe just a fruit tree or a blueberry bush, whatever you're working with. Maybe you just have something in a pot on your back landing. Maybe you have a set of herbs in your kitchen, or maybe you have houseplants. So you can see how gardens can be big or small. They can be indoor or outdoor. There are so many different ways, and you don't have to have a ton of money or a ton of acreage to have a great garden that you love. But you also want to get the most out of it. Whether you're planting some herbs inside, you want to make sure they're ready for when you want to cook, Or let's say you're planting an ornamental garden outside. You just want to make sure you're able to enjoy, and maybe you're planting a pollinator garden and you want to make sure that it attracts all the pollinators that you want, your hummingbirds, your bees, your butterflies, all of the things. Or maybe you want to make sure there's habitat for hedgehogs. I don't know. Every garden has a purpose, and usually more than one. And it can be pure enjoyment, but it usually has some other purpose as well. So when we think about getting the most out of our garden, we also can think about getting the most out of our volunteer organization, our volunteer strategy. And we want to make sure that our volunteers feel like they're giving their best. Because when we are making a true impact in partnership with our volunteers, they feel better about it, because that's the reason they volunteer in the first place, right? So let's take a look at training. Trellises. This is my trellis in Washington State, and these are recycled alder limbs from some trees. We had a lot of like sucklings coming up, or saplings coming up, and we needed to clear them out a little bit. And so I said, we're not throwing anything away. Our philosophy in our garden and in our little small holding is we keep everything, we reuse everything. So I'm creating these little, my husband and I created these trellises. They're absolutely beautiful. So there's no reason volunteer organizations and volunteer programs shouldn't be beautiful, shouldn't be full of love, shouldn't be creative, shouldn't be exciting to be a part of, right? And when we did this, we were so proud, and you should be proud of the work you're doing, right? The other thing that trellising, when we think about leadership and training, you think about those are small little cucumber plants, little lemon cucumbers, little pickling cucumbers. I did a long Japanese cucumber. I was testing everything out. And when you first have plants in, you've got to kind of connect them, the little tendrils, to the pieces of twine so that they can start growing. They know which direction to start growing, to find the airflow, to find the sun. But once they latch on, they're pretty good to grow on their own. You might need to guide a little bit from time to time, but for the most part, you are helping. Once they're connected, they're growing on their own. It's the same with volunteers. If the structure is good, we can help them get connected during their orientation period and then start to fly on their own, right? And we don't need to be in there nitpicking every little thing, right? Because they're well prepared. The other thing to think about is your volunteer leaders can help lead other leaders and other volunteers. So your volunteer leaders can actually act as your trellis. So they can help you help the new volunteers coming in. And I think we still have plenty of opportunity to bring volunteer leaders in, or to promote volunteer leaders to help within our own departments. If we have even if we're a department of one, to bring volunteers to walk the talk, to model the way for the rest of the organization. If we're not doing that, then if we're not being that space for volunteers to grow, how can we expect other departments to be welcoming of volunteers? We've got to lead the way. So that's another way that I think about trellising. Ruth, what do you think about trellising? Anything come to mind through this conversation?
Just as you were talking about that, reminded me of at the same garden I was doing where some people were planting vines, and within minutes the little tendrils coming out reached around the tree that they were standing next to. So I think I really like that kind of metaphor of give people the basics, and then they'll start growing and developing in the way that they know will meet the needs of the organization. I think that was beautiful.
The other thing is, trellises can be made out of found objects. We don't have to go to the gardening center and spend like $100 on a trellis. Like, this is found objects. When I went to Hampton Court Palace, I went to the Tilt Garden, which is where they were renovating the old vegetable. Well, it wasn't a vegetable garden back in the day, but they were using some of the old techniques. So they had, teepee type, like this, trellises. They had a variety of trellises, absolutely beautiful, made from found material on the site. And so when we think about providing training, we don't always have to create it all on our own. We don't always have to spend tons and tons of money, although sometimes we need the tools. Like I needed to get the the twine. We can also work with our volunteers to provide, again, that kind of training, because who better knows than the volunteer doing the job how to do it well. And they usually have some shortcuts and tips that we don't know about.
No, but then we can start incorporating it because
That's right.
learning
That's right.
Yeah.
When I would train my volunteers, one of my first jobs working with volunteers was training. I had a regional trainer. I was going to about 5 different sites every month and upskilling everybody and doing update training. And I would find out all these little cheat sheets and little job aids people had created to do. And I'm like, wait a minute, we need to standardize this. This is fantastic, right? So season extenders. Okay, here's one more trivia for you before we are at near the end. We're near the end, but which garden is this? Just wondering if anybody knows. This one's a good one. So season extenders and volunteer retention. So what season extenders can be a simple row cover, simple piece of agribon or landscape or plant fabric over some plants that are just peeking out in the early spring and we don't want them to die from frost. Season extenders can also protect plants that need to actually be warmer than the outside environment. And so sometimes things stay in glass houses all the time because they can't really survive out in other areas. So we think about volunteers and the amount of support they need. We have to be flexible about that support. Do volunteers with disabilities need reasonable accommodation in order to volunteer? What kind of tools do volunteers need? Are we going to move them inside, outside? Are we going to protect them? We do, I do row covers and I create little things out of plastic PVC pipe and landscape irrigation pipe, and I can create these hoops and cover when it gets cold, and then when it gets warm I can take it off. It also protects from predators, like we have a cabbage mothworm that will eat your kale. If you don't protect it, your kale is gone. By midsummer, your kale is eaten alive. So there's things we have to protect from, but we also can get the best out of our volunteers by helping them through seasonal support. So I have a question. Chelsea Physic Garden. Yes, Karen, it is a Chelsea. This is a historic glass house. These glass houses, if you have not been to the Chelsea Physic Garden, it started in the 1400s. Insane. These glass houses, I don't think they're from the 1400s, but they are really old. And it's just about learning more. It's a garden where you learn about all the medicinal uses of plants. It's a beautiful garden if you get a chance. But so I have a question for you. What makes your volunteers feel challenged or stressed? I want you to put it in the chat. The glass house here is to help reduce the challenge and stress on these plants, right? We still got to get in and water. We still got to tend them, but we're not just putting them in the glass house and leaving them alone. But what makes your volunteers feel challenged or stressed? And go ahead and put in the chat. Lack of trust, new systems. Yeah. Competing commitments and responsibilities. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Anything else that people have? What's creating extra stress on your volunteers? Ask them to complete mandatory training. I love the word mandatory. I think we can change some of the words we use. Like, we ask that all volunteers participate in this training so that we can give clients the best support ever. Isn't that just better than complete this mandatory training or you can't be a volunteer? It's just, there's a different way, right? There's a different way. Lack of process. Yeah. Feeling like a resource or an employee. Yes. So how can we provide within what we have and some of the things that Helen and I have talked about today? How could we provide, as leaders of volunteers, supports to reduce that stress? Now, again, like gardening, we don't get to control the world. We don't get to control how much rain comes this year or next year. We don't get to control the number of days with sun and without sun. We can make a contribution to changing climate, but it's not completely and entirely within our control. stuck in the same role without escape. Yes. So how can we provide support within our locus of control? And go ahead and share in the chat. Is it helping a volunteer change roles or change sites and giving them a new assignment? Is it creating more recognition and reward programs for volunteers? Is it just being conscious about positive reinforcement and helping our coworkers who are supervising volunteers learn how to give corrective and confirming feedback in a balanced way? Some of those are just the ways, plus everything else we've talked about. Ruth, what do you think about season extenders and volunteering?
I think there's something around giving them a rest as well. So letting them bed down for a little while and not have to feel that they have to come back all the time, but knowing there's a way of going, okay, I'm just going to take a break and then come back when I need need to.
Yeah, we talked about crop rotation. I didn't mention it today. I must have missed it in my notes. But crop rotation, also, you should not be planting your tomatoes or peppers in the same spot because they will not thrive after a few years. So we rotate them every 3 or 4 years. And so that may be something. Sometimes we leave a bed, we let it lay fallow and just put a little bit of cover crop on it and we let it rest. So sometimes we need to give our volunteers a rest. Good point.
Yeah. And there's also something around really listening to them, asking for their opinions and then really listening to it and not just have a pocket.
Yeah, I think people feeling heard, and that's part of that communication. That's part of also managing upward. If our leadership feel that they are being heard and we are, there's a great book I just read, or I'm reading in the midst of reading. It's called Super Communicators. Charles Duhigg, Duhigg, and it's about matching the type of making sure you're matching the type of conversation and also being really good at listening and sharing and making sure everybody knows they're understood. And it doesn't matter who at what level in your org chart. So it's a great book. We did some training on it last week inside the Impact Lab. But season support. So.
And on the note of book recommendation, thank you, Rick, for your recommendation about Brilliant Green. That does look like a good book to have a look at. Take a look. Maybe you'd love it, I'm sure. So to wrap up, one of the things we really also wanted to remind you all of, gardeners are really proud of their gardens. Tobi, tell us about what we can see here. Big it up.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? This is produce I got from a really good year in our garden. As leaders and volunteers, we have really good years and not so great years. It's just how life is, right? This was a particularly amazing year. I was so proud. I was sharing this with all my family and friends. Look how much produce I picked. And it was amazing that it all came out at the same time. Like, how can you get cabbage and tomatoes at the same time? I don't know how it happened. I really don't. I got okra. It was amazing. So I'm being proud and I'm doing a little bit of bragging about my garden.
You should do. And that's exactly what people who involve volunteers should be doing. And that's why coming to days like this and hearing from our colleagues and taking the opportunity to brag about it in the chat is exactly what you should be doing as well. But what is it that holds you back from telling everybody about how great you are, from celebrating your wins? Put in the chat some of the great wins you've had and think about, why do I not tell this more often, and how you can share your expertise. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. What's holding you back? I think it's a great question. I think we don't, Ruth, I don't think we know the impact. We're a drop of water in a calm lake, and our little tiny ripple goes really far, a lot farther than we realize, especially in the people business, in leading volunteers. If you think about when you're creating the culture of volunteerism, how many people does that actually impact? It even impacts the volunteer's family. I used to work with a volunteer coordinator who she would do an annual recognition event, and she would invite the spouses of the volunteers for lunch. And I used to train them every month. So I would show up and I would meet all the spouses, and she would thank the spouses for making volunteering possible, for taking up like maybe some of the chores, or providing a little extra of the budget, the family budget, whatever it was. And so if we have a great day volunteering, we come home and we talk about it with our families. And so that feel good like actually transfers. If we have a bad day volunteering, the opposite happens. So we are impacting so many people way beyond what we think.
Absolutely. Luke, what have you got to add? I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Hello? How about now?
Hello. There you
Yeah.
are. You're fine.
I was typing and then I thought it's easy to just say it out loud, I think, if that's okay.
course.
So the way I was thinking was that I work in a university, so the volunteering is very cyclical, right? So you tend to see some new things and some of the same things year on year. I think sometimes you can get a bit inured to the same thing happening over and over again, to the extent that you really, to Toby's point here, you really only highlight it when it's something different. And that's probably not, at least psychologically for myself, that's probably not fair for all the people that are doing the exact same things that's happened in previous years, but really it takes more to impress you, I suppose. You know what I mean? So I think that can be something that sometimes it's hard to take a step back and think, even though that's just the same as what was done last year, that's really good, you know, and your standards are still high, but I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm articulating this particularly well.
No,
Yes.
that makes sense. That does make sense. And I think there's something around how, as people who involve volunteers, we're so good at telling how great the volunteers are, which is completely accurate as well. But then we forget to also say what it was that we did that could help enable that. So Toby's example of really being there as a volunteer manager and saying, this is a great thing to do, is that other element of thinking, how do we emphasize that so that people can see the value of this profession?
And to what Joanna just said, oh, sorry, Toby.
Yeah, I was thinking just, you know, I've been thinking lately of all the things I've been doing for a decade. So our Pro News newsletter, decade. We are now in our 10th year of every single Wednesday. I've been, and I have to write my newsletter when I jump off, just full disclosure. But every Wednesday for 10 years, I've created that newsletter, and I started celebrating myself for that, because I thought, you know what kind of commitment is that? That's not, you know, people try to, you know, win audiences and win in the, you know, in social media with manipulation, etc. And I'm like, no. Some of our best stuff is our consistency. So to your point, Luke, when your volunteer program is running consistently and you have standards that are working, those should be celebrated. You know, as a volunteer, I'm about to reach my 10th year as a Master Gardener volunteer. And since the pandemic, I've been doing the same volunteer role, which is our Saturday morning Gardening Tips Live on Facebook. I love it. There's no need to change. And we have you know, the same things happen in our gardens every year, more or less. And then we learn new things, we share, and people get so much joy out of it. And so sometimes volunteers want to stay in the place they're in, and that's good too.
And Joanna, I love what you put in the chat around new volunteers. So
Absolutely,
making sure we're recognizing and celebrating and spotlighting new volunteers, not just some of the people who've been around for a while. That's a great way of thinking around it.
Because you know what? If someone has managed to figure out their schedule of to find time to volunteer at a time when they didn't think they had time before, that's probably something worth celebrating in and of itself in this day and age, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, think about what volunteers are giving. It is their most valuable asset. The minutes, I love to mention this because people forget the seconds, minutes, hours, days, years, months, years, whatever each of us has left on this planet. It is our most valuable asset. It's not our money. Our time is our most valuable asset. And so when people decide to contribute that to your organization, it is a huge gift. And I think sometimes our organizations take that for granted, that people are making sacrifices in their lives to contribute to our good causes. And so we have to remind people what they've sacrificed. Like every Saturday morning, when I was in the West Coast, I got up at 5:30 in the morning, every Saturday morning, because of the time change, to do my volunteering at 6 a.m. It was not always easy, but I love my team and I love what we do. And so, you know, that's how our volunteers think and do. They're fantastic for that.
Perfect. And other thing to think around of us as volunteer managers is using days like this for it come together, joining the organisations like AVM and Heritage Volunteering and Volunteer Management in the Hospice, taking part in all of those kind of things. There, it's a great place to really show what we've done and what we've achieved. But yes, what have you got out of this? What are your aha moments from hearing us talk today?
Yeah, I would, Chris is reminding us volunteers are not plants, nor are they day laborers, nor are they cash machines or ATMs. But I don't know. I don't know, Chris. I think plants have souls. But yes.
We've covered today's session, false, plants have souls. You know, there's you get everything you come to a secrecy conference. I think that's what we can comfortably say.
I think you need to read this book that Rick had recommended. It's about history and science of plant intelligence and how it all communicates.
Yes, trees communicate. They send nutrients to one another, even trees of different species. It is so cool. Aha moments from today, and folks can unmute themselves if we want. Chris, I'm thinking we're done at the bottom of the hour. Is that when we're done?
So yeah, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes to go on the official time frame. People can stay as long as they want within reason. You know, we'll leave the meeting, we'll leave people chat. More people feel free, put your hand up, have a chat, let us know you've got from the day. So it's nice, we want to hear people's voices. We don't want to just run at the end. Go for it, Luke.
I really thank you very much, Toby and Ruth. I really like the metaphor, partly because I used to work in a historic. My Saturday job as a teenager was I used to work in a historic walled garden where I pretended to be a Victorian all day in a historic estate, right? And it made me think a lot because it was a walled garden, right? Which is already interesting because you're very restrictive about what could be in there. But also we had certain restrictions about what could and couldn't be planted because we were supposed to be a garden in 1805. It's technically Georgian, I guess, right? But we were only allowed to use heritage seeds and we weren't allowed to use any non-authentic methods of pesticides or anything like that. So we were like crushing garlic and eggshells and stuff like that. And I think when it comes to volunteering, it kind of made me think about like how many of these rules and strictures do we place on ourselves are arbitrary and what is the actual point of it? Because I would say about 1% of the people that visited our garden were quite impressed that we didn't use pesticides, but most people were like, oh, okay, if you say so. Why are you wearing a tricorn hat? So it sort of the different focus is quite interesting, and I'm not sure whether I want to draw a comparison between heritage varieties and volunteers because I don't know if that's necessarily a safe way to go down, but they are more difficult to grow, that's for sure. But it gave me a lot to think about. I'm not entirely sure. I might have got a bit lost in the metaphors along the way. We also tried to grow pineapples because that was something that my estate had historically tried to do. And this is in the Midlands of the UK. So like,
yeah,
not anywhere where you would grow pineapples. I'm not really sure. It gave me a lot to think about. I'm not entirely sure how it all links to volunteering, but I do like the idea.
Well, I think I would just say, taking on the walled garden metaphor and your historic garden metaphor, that's the mission of the organization. So you needed to align the garden with the mission. It's similar with volunteers. In your volunteer strategy and volunteer roles, you need to align them with the mission of the organization so that, and not every garden is for everybody, and not every volunteer opportunity is for every volunteer.